What if I told you that the monster who would one day terrorize an entire nation, who would commit acts so unspeakable that seasoned detectives would weep at crime scenes, who would become synonymous with the very word evil, once started as a curious little boy collecting roadkill in the woods behind his house? What if I told you that his father, a chemist, actually taught him how to preserve animal bones, not knowing he was handing his son the first tool in a future workshop of horrors? What if I told you that 17 young men would lose their lives to someone who, by all outward appearances, seemed painfully ordinary? This is not just a story about a serial killer. This is a story about how a society failed to see the warning signs, how the system abandoned victims, how prejudice allowed a predator to hunt freely, and ultimately, how justice found its way to the darkest corner of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I am going to take you through the complete, unfiltered journey of Jeffrey Dahmer, from his troubled childhood to his final breath behind prison walls. But I warn you, this story will challenge everything you think you know about evil, about humanity, and about the thin line that separates the two. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you believe that stories like this matter, that understanding darkness helps us protect the light, then hit that subscribe button right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because the lessons buried in this tragedy are ones we cannot afford to forget. Now let us begin. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. By all accounts, his arrival into this world was unremarkable. He was a healthy baby, blonde-haired and blue-eyed, the picture of American innocence. His father, Lionel, was pursuing a degree in chemistry, working long hours, while his mother, Joyce, struggled with her own demons, namely anxiety, and what would later be understood as mental health challenges that went largely untreated in that era. The family moved frequently during Jeffrey's early years, following Lionel's academic and professional pursuits. They settled in Bath Township, Ohio, when Jeffrey was around 8 years old, moving into a house that sat on several acres of woodland. It was here, in these quiet Ohio woods, that young Jeffrey developed his first obsession. He became fascinated with dead animals. Now, childhood curiosity about death is not inherently abnormal. Many children encounter roadkill or deceased pets and ask questions about mortality. But Jeffrey's interest went deeper. He would actively search for dead animals, collecting their remains, studying their decomposition with an intensity that unsettled those who noticed. His father, Lionel, trying to connect with his increasingly withdrawn son, saw this interest through the lens of scientific curiosity. After all, Lionel was a chemist. He understood the desire to understand how things worked at their most fundamental level. So Lionel taught Jeffrey how to properly preserve animal bones using bleach. He showed him how to clean specimens, how to strip away flesh, how to create what he thought were innocent natural science projects. Father and son would work together in the garage, and for brief moments there was connection between them. What Lionel did not see, what he could not have known, was that he was providing technical training for something far more sinister. The bleach, the careful preservation techniques, the clinical approach to handling remains, these skills would resurface decades later in apartment 213, where Jeffrey would apply them not to animals, but to human beings. As Jeffrey grew older, his isolation deepened. His parents' marriage was crumbling around him, filled with constant arguments and bitter resentment. Joyce's mental health deteriorated, leading to hospitalizations and prolonged absences. Lionel, consumed by his work and the failing marriage, was emotionally unavailable. Young Jeffrey retreated further into himself. By high school, Jeffrey discovered alcohol. His first drink was a revelation. For the first time in his life, the constant anxiety, the overwhelming sense of being different, the dark fantasies that had begun to creep into his consciousness, all of it quieted. The noise in his head dimmed. He felt something approaching normal. He began drinking in the morning before school, smuggling alcohol in coffee cups, maintaining a constant low-level intoxication that allowed him to function while keeping his inner demons at bay. His classmates at Revere High School in Richfield, Ohio, remember him as the class clown, a label that masks something more complex. Jeffrey engaged in what students called doing a Dahmer, acting out, making bizarre noises, pretending to have seizures or cerebral palsy. He was seeking attention, certainly, but there was something else there too. A desperation to be seen, to be included, even if only through negative attention. Beneath this clown persona, darker impulses were taking shape. Jeffrey later admitted that his sexual fantasies, which had begun in early adolescence, carried a disturbing element from the very beginning. His attraction to other males was complicated by violent ideation, by images of control, dominance, and ultimately possession. He did not just want connection, he wanted complete ownership of another person. In his senior year, while his parents were finalizing a bitter divorce, Jeffrey was essentially living alone in the family home. His mother had taken his younger brother David and moved out. His father had relocated to a motel. For weeks, 18-year-old Jeffrey existed in complete isolation. No supervision, no structure, no one to notice as he spiraled further into his fantasies. It was during this period that he began driving around Bath Township, looking for hitchhikers. He was not looking for conversation or companionship in any normal sense. He was hunting. And on June 18, 1978, just 3 weeks after his high school graduation, Jeffrey Dahmer found his first victim. His name was Stephen Hicks. He was 19 years old, just a year older than Jeffrey. He had been hitchhiking, heading home from a rock concert. He was young, free, with his whole life ahead of him. When Jeffrey Dahmer pulled over and offered him a ride, Stephen probably felt lucky. A friendly face, a chance to get home faster. They went back to Jeffrey's empty house. They drank beer together. And then, when Stephen said he needed to leave, something in Jeffrey snapped. He could not let him go. He could not stand the thought of being alone again, of this brief moment of connection ending. So he picked up a barbell and struck Stephen Hicks from behind, crushing his skull. Then he strangled him to make certain he was dead. In those terrible moments, Jeffrey Dahmer crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He had taken a human life. And though he would later claim this act horrified him, that he spent the next 9 years trying not to kill again. The method of what came next suggests something far more calculated. He dismembered Stephen's body with a knife he had prepared beforehand. He placed the remains in garbage bags and buried them in the woods behind his house. When that felt insufficient, he dug up the remains, stripped the flesh from the bones using the techniques his father had taught him, crushed the bones with a sledgehammer, and scattered them throughout the woodland. no one ever reported Stephen Hicks missing. His disappearance went unnoticed by the wider world, and Jeffrey Dahmer, murderer at 18, returned to what passed for his normal life. The morning after his first murder, Jeffrey Dahmer woke up in his childhood home with blood still crusted beneath his fingernails and a body buried in his backyard. He was 18 years old, and he had just committed an act that should have shattered any semblance of normal life. But here is what few people understand about the psychology of killers like Dahmer. They are exceptional compartmentalizers. Jeffrey got up that morning, showered, and went about his day as if nothing had happened. Stephen Hicks was in the ground, and Jeffrey Dahmer continued to breathe, to eat, to exist in a world that had no idea what he had done. That fall, Jeffrey enrolled at Ohio State University, a decision pushed by his father, who hoped higher education might give his troubled son direction. It was a disaster from the first week. Jeffrey had no interest in academics, no ability to connect with classmates, and an ever-deepening relationship with alcohol. He spent most of his brief college career intoxicated, alone in his dorm room, selling his plasma to buy more alcohol. He lasted one semester. His grades were abysmal, his attendance virtually non-existent, and by December 1978, he had dropped out entirely. His father, frustrated and unsure how to help his increasingly erratic son, made a decision that would shape the next 3 years of Jeffrey's life. Lionel Dahmer enlisted his son in the United States Army. In January 1979, Jeffrey Dahmer arrived at Fort McClellan, Alabama, for basic training as a military police officer. Later, he would be stationed in Baumholder, West Germany, working as a combat medic. It seemed for a brief moment like the structure might save him. The Army provided what Jeffrey had always lacked: routine, discipline, and enforced sobriety during training hours. But the military could not rewire Jeffrey Dahmer's fundamental nature. His fellow soldiers remember him as quiet, strange, and increasingly dependent on alcohol during off-duty hours. He would drink alone in his bunk, consuming entire bottles of alcohol in single sittings. His performance deteriorated rapidly, and there were darker whispers too. Later investigations would suggest that Dahmer may have committed sexual assaults against fellow soldiers, drugging them and violating them while they were unconscious. These accusations were never proven, but the pattern that would emerge in Milwaukee may have had its first rehearsals in West Germany. In March 1981, just over 2 years into his enlistment, the Army discharged Jeffrey Dahmer. The official reason was alcohol abuse, though the full picture was likely more complex. He was given a general discharge, not quite dishonorable, but certainly not a proud conclusion to his military service. At 20 years old, Jeffrey Dahmer was adrift once again. He did not return to Ohio immediately. Instead, he went to Miami Beach, Florida, where he lived for a few months, working at a sandwich shop and continuing his descent into alcoholism. He slept on the beach some nights, spent his meager earnings on alcohol, and existed in a state of perpetual intoxication. Whatever restraint had kept him from killing again since Stephen Hicks seemed to hold, but just barely. The fantasies never stopped. They only grew more elaborate, more consuming. Eventually, Jeffrey's money ran out entirely, and he made a collect call to his father asking for help. Lionel Dahmer, now remarried to a woman named Sherry, agreed to take Jeffrey in on the condition that he get treatment for his alcoholism. Jeffrey returned to Ohio and briefly attempted to get sober, but the effort was half-hearted at best. He could not function without alcohol. It was the only thing that quieted the constant roar of his violent fantasies. In late 1981, Lionel sent Jeffrey to live with his grandmother Catherine in West Allis, Wisconsin, a suburb of Milwaukee. Catherine Dahmer was a kind, religious woman who welcomed her troubled grandson with open arms. She hoped she might provide the stability and love that had been missing from his chaotic childhood. For a time, her optimism seemed justified. The next 6 years with his grandmother represented the longest period of relative calm in Jeffrey Dahmer's adult life. He found work at a blood plasma center, then later at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory in Milwaukee. He contributed to household expenses. He attended church with his grandmother occasionally. He appeared from the outside to be a young man slowly finding his footing. But appearances, as we know, can be devastatingly deceiving. Throughout this period, Jeffrey was developing and refining his methods of predation. He frequented gay bars and bathhouses in Milwaukee, not for genuine connection, but to scout potential victims. He experimented with drugging drinks, discovering which substances could render someone unconscious without killing them. He would take men back to his grandmother's basement, drug them, and spend hours with their unconscious bodies, acting out fantasies while they were unaware. This was Jeffrey's compromise with himself. He told himself that if he did not kill, he was controlling his urges. If he only drugged and violated unconscious men, he was not truly a monster. It was a delusion that allowed him to maintain the facade of normalcy while committing serious crimes. Several of these victims reported waking up disoriented and violated, but had no clear memory of what had happened. Many did not go to the police, either out of shame, confusion, or fear of not being believed. The system that should have protected them failed at every turn. In September 1986, Jeffrey was arrested for the first time. He had exposed himself to two 12-year-old boys near the Kinnickinnic River, an incident that should have raised immediate red flags about his predatory nature. He was charged with indecent exposure and, incredibly, received only a 1-year probationary sentence. The legal system looked at this 26-year-old man who had committed a sexual offense against children and decided he deserved another chance. Less than a year later, in September 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer would claim his second victim. His name was Stephen Tuomi, a 24-year-old from Ontonagon, Michigan. Jeffrey met him at a gay bar called Club 219. They went to a room at the Ambassador Hotel, where Jeffrey planned his usual routine. Drug the man, spend the night with his unconscious body, then leave before he woke up. But something went wrong. Jeffrey claimed he blacked out from his own intoxication and woke up the next morning to find Stephen dead beside him, showing signs of strangulation and trauma. Whether this was truly accidental or whether Jeffrey's self-control finally cracked under the weight of his fantasies, we will never know with certainty. What we do know is that Jeffrey Dahmer's response was chillingly calculated. He purchased a large suitcase, placed Stephen's body inside, transported it back to his grandmother's basement, and spent the next week dismembering and disposing of the remains. The skills his father had taught him for preserving animal bones now served their true, terrible purpose. No one ever reported Stephen Tuomi missing with enough urgency to generate a serious investigation. Another young man disappeared, and the world moved on without noticing. From this point forward, Jeffrey Dahmer's restraint crumbled entirely. The dam had broken. 4 months after Stephen Tuomi's death, Jeffrey Dahmer killed again. On January 16, 1988, he lured 14-year-old Jamie Dockstader to his grandmother's house with an offer of money for posing for photographs. Jamie was a Native American teenager who had run away from home and was surviving on the streets of Milwaukee. He was vulnerable. He was looking for any opportunity to earn money, and he had no way of knowing that the quiet, seemingly ordinary man who approached him was a predator in human form. What happened in Catherine Dahmer's basement that night follows a pattern that would become horrifyingly familiar over the next 3 years. Jeffrey drugged Jamie, strangled him once he was unconscious, engaged in sexual acts with the body, then dismembered and disposed of the remains. Each step was methodical. Each action showed an increasing comfort with the mechanics of murder. Just 2 months later, in March 1988, Jeffrey claimed another victim. Richard Guerrero was 22 years old, a young man trying to find his way in the world. Jeffrey met him outside a gay bar called the Phoenix and offered him money to spend the night. The offer of financial compensation was a tactic Jeffrey had refined. It targeted men who were economically vulnerable, who needed money badly enough to overlook warning signs. Richard went home with Jeffrey and never left alive. His grandmother began noticing strange smells emanating from the basement and garage. There were late-night noises she could not explain. Her previously quiet household had developed an unsettling atmosphere. Finally, in April 1988, Catherine asked Jeffrey to move out. She was uncomfortable, though she could never have imagined the true reason for her unease. Jeffrey found an apartment at 808 North 24th Street in Milwaukee. His brief period of living alone there produced no killings, but it did produce another arrest. In September 1988, Jeffrey encountered a 13-year-old Laotian boy named Somsak Synthesomphone. He lured the boy to his apartment with an offer of money for photographs, drugged him, and sexually assaulted him. But this time, the victim survived. Somsak escaped while Jeffrey was away and told his parents what had happened. Jeffrey was arrested and charged with second-degree sexual assault and enticement of a child for immoral purposes. This was not a minor offense. This was a clear pattern of predatory behavior against minors. He had now committed sexual offenses against children twice. The system had another chance to stop Jeffrey Dahmer before his body count grew higher. They failed. The case dragged through the courts for months. During this time, Jeffrey remained free, attending required meetings with probation officers while continuing to hunt. In March 1989, while awaiting sentencing, he met Anthony Sears, a handsome 24-year-old aspiring model. Anthony was charming, popular, and by all accounts a young man with tremendous potential. Jeffrey convinced Anthony's friend to drop them both off at his grandmother's house, claiming it was his own. There, he drugged and strangled Anthony, then kept his skull as a trophy. It was the first time Jeffrey preserved a body part for future possession. The compulsion to keep his victims with him permanently had fully emerged. In May 1989, Jeffrey Dahmer was finally sentenced for the Synthesomphone assault. The prosecutor asked for 5 to 6 years in prison. They presented evidence of Jeffrey's prior conviction for indecent exposure. They argued he was a danger to the community, particularly to children. The defense countered with character witnesses, including Jeffrey's father and stepmother, who pleaded for treatment rather than incarceration. Judge William Gardner sentenced Jeffrey Dahmer to 5 years probation, with 1 year in a work release program that allowed him to work during the day and returned to jail only at night. He was required to register as a sex offender and continue treatment. At no point during this process did anyone connect Jeffrey to the disappearances of young men around Milwaukee. No one looked deeper into the quiet man with the flat affect who had now committed documented offenses against 2 children. Here's where I need to pause and ask you something. As you are hearing this, as you are learning about the chances that were missed, do you feel frustrated? Do you feel angry? Because I do. I have spent countless hours researching this case, and every time I reach this moment, I want to reach through time and shake everyone involved. 2 separate incidents with children, documented sexual offenses, and the system let him walk. I want to know what you think. Drop a comment below and tell me, where do you think the system failed most critically? Was it the judges, the prosecutors, the police who never connected the dots? Your perspective matters in this conversation. Jeffrey was released from his work release program in March 1990. He had served 10 months, and within 3 months of his release, he would begin the most prolific killing spree of his entire horrific career. On May 14, 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments, located at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee. The building was a modest, somewhat run-down complex in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. Jeffrey, who was white, stood out slightly among his neighbors, but not enough to generate real suspicion. He was quiet, kept to himself, and always paid his rent on time. He was, in the eyes of his landlord, an ideal tenant. Inside those walls, Jeffrey Dahmer created a chamber of horrors that defies comprehension. The apartment was small, approximately 580 square feet. There was a living room, bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom. Jeffrey decorated it simply, almost sparingly. But the true contents of that space would eventually shock a nation. Within weeks of moving in, Jeffrey claimed his next victim. Raymond Smith, also known as Ricky Beeks, was a 32-year-old sex worker. Jeffrey picked him up at Club 219, brought him back to apartment 213, and performed his now ritualistic murder: drug, strangle, possess. But something had shifted in Jeffrey's psychology. He was no longer satisfied with merely killing. The previous year, he had kept Anthony Sears' skull as a trophy. Now he began expanding his collection. He purchased a Polaroid camera and began photographing his victims at various stages of the process, creating a visual record of his crimes that would later prove essential in his prosecution. He started preserving body parts in his freezer. He began experimenting with ways to keep his victims in a state between life and death, seeking total control. In June 1990, he killed Edward Smith, 27 years old. In September, he killed Ernest Miller, 22, and David Thomas, 23. With each killing, his methods became more elaborate. He began attempting to create what he called zombies, drilling holes in victims' skulls while they were still alive and injecting chemicals into their brains. He wanted compliant companions, people who would stay with him forever, who could not leave, who could not reject him. The psychological loneliness driving these actions was profound, but it manifested in acts of unspeakable cruelty. The neighbors in the Oxford Apartments began noticing things. Strange smells emanated from apartment 213, smells that residents described as rotten and overwhelming. Jeffrey explained them away as meat that had spoiled in his freezer when he forgot to pay his electric bill. the explanations were accepted. No one wanted to believe the worst. Some neighbors heard sounds too. Power tools running at odd hours. Saw noises in the middle of the night. Thuds and bumps that suggested something heavy being moved. When people complained, Jeffrey apologized, saying he was simply doing home repairs or moving furniture. Again, the explanations were accepted. The alternative was too horrific to contemplate. Between September 1990 and February 1991, Jeffrey killed 4 more young men: Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, and Conorak Synthesomphone. Each killing followed a similar pattern, but each victim was a unique human being with dreams, families, and people who loved them. Curtis Straughter was 18 years old, an aspiring model who was trying to earn money for his education. Errol Lindsay was 19, a young man helping to raise his niece and supporting his family. Tony Hughes was 31, deaf since childhood, a man known for his infectious smile and his love of dancing despite being unable to hear the music. And Conorak Synthesomphone was 14 years old, the younger brother of Somsak, the boy Jeffrey had been convicted of molesting in 1988. Yes, you read that correctly. 3 years after Jeffrey was convicted of drugging and assaulting Somsak's Synthesomphone, he encountered Somsak's younger brother Conorak by chance and made him his victim too. The coincidence is almost impossible to accept, but the tragedy that followed makes it even harder to bear. On May 27, 1991, Conorak Synthesomphone somehow escaped from apartment 213. He was naked, bleeding from a wound in his head and clearly disoriented from the drugs Jeffrey had given him. 2 young women, Sandra Smith and her cousin Nicole Childress, found Conorak wandering in the street. They immediately called 911, recognizing that something was terribly wrong. When police officers John Balserzak and Joseph Gabrish arrived, Jeffrey Dahmer was already there. He'd followed Conorak outside and was attempting to retrieve him. Jeffrey told the officers that Conorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they had simply had a domestic dispute after drinking too much. He was calm, articulate, and convincing. The officers escorted Jeffrey and Conorak back to apartment 213. They briefly entered the apartment, noting a strange smell but not investigating further. In the bedroom, just feet away from where they stood, was the decomposing body of Tony Hughes, killed 3 days earlier. But the officers did not look. They did not search. They accepted Jeffrey's explanation and left Conorak in his custody. Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress pleaded with the officers to help the boy. They insisted something was wrong, that the child clearly needed medical attention, that he could not consent to anything in his condition. Their concerns were dismissed. The fire department paramedics who had responded to the call were also sent away, despite noting that Conorak appeared to be a minor and was clearly injured. Within an hour of the police leaving, Jeffrey Dahmer strangled Conorak Synthesomphone to death. The failure of those officers, of that entire system, allowed Jeffrey Dahmer to kill 4 more young men over the next 2 months. Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft all lost their lives in apartment 213 that summer. They lost their lives because prejudice blinded the authorities to what was happening right in front of them. A white man's word was taken over the observable evidence. A young boy's life was thrown away because officers couldn't be bothered to do their jobs. Inside apartment 213, Jeffrey Dahmer had created more than a crime scene. He had created a temple to his obsessions. a grotesque monument to his compulsion to possess other human beings completely. And central to this monument were the photographs. Jeffrey documented everything. He took Polaroid pictures of his victims before, during, and after their deaths. Some images showed men in vulnerable states, drugged but still alive, unaware of what was about to happen. Others documented the dismemberment process in clinical detail. Still others showed the final arrangements of body parts, posed and displayed according to whatever dark aesthetic Jeffrey pursued. Why the photographs? This question has haunted investigators, psychologists, and criminologists for decades. The simple answer is that Jeffrey wanted to preserve these moments forever. His deepest fear was abandonment, being left alone. By photographing his victims, he could revisit these experiences indefinitely. He could look at the images whenever loneliness overwhelmed him and feel, in his twisted perception, that he was not alone. The photographs also suggest something even more disturbing about Jeffrey's psychological state. He was creating evidence intentionally. Some serial killers go to extraordinary lengths to avoid documentation, to leave no trace of their crimes. Jeffrey did the opposite. He photographed, he collected, he preserved. On some level, he may have wanted to be caught. The burden of his secret life had become almost unbearable. And the cognitive dissonance between his ordinary factory worker existence and his private horrors was fracturing his already fragile psyche. By mid-1991, Jeffrey was killing at a rate of approximately 1 victim per week. His apartment had become a charnel house. Human remains were everywhere. There were skulls in the closet, preserved hearts and organs in the freezer, a vat of acid in the corner where Jeffrey dissolved body parts he could not preserve. The smell was overwhelming, seeping through walls and floors, alerting neighbors to something wrong, even if they could not identify what. Jeffrey's mental state was deteriorating rapidly. He was drinking more heavily than ever, sometimes consuming entire bottles of alcohol in single sittings. He was sleeping erratically. He was missing work. The careful compartmentalization that had allowed him to function for years was breaking down. At the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, supervisors noticed changes in their quiet employee. Jeffrey had always been dependable, if unremarkable. Now he was showing up late, leaving early, appearing disheveled and distracted. His job performance suffered significantly, but this was a factory job in 1991. As long as he showed up most of the time and did the minimum required, he kept his position. Meanwhile, families were searching desperately for their missing loved ones. Parents filed missing person reports. Siblings visited neighborhoods where their brothers had last been seen. The gay community in Milwaukee was beginning to recognize that something was very wrong, that too many young men were vanishing without explanation. But the investigations went nowhere. Police departments were underfunded and overwhelmed. Missing young men, particularly young men of color from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, did not receive the same investigative priority as other cases. And there was no technology linking these disappearances, no database that might have revealed the pattern of young men vanishing after visiting the same bars, the same neighborhood. Some families hired private investigators. Others conducted their own searches, posting flyers and canvassing neighborhoods. The Synthosamphone family, still traumatized by what had happened to Somsack years earlier, had no idea their younger son had encountered the same predator. They had reported Conorak missing, but their reports went into the same system that had already failed them once. And the mothers of the victims showed particular determination. Glenda Cleveland, the woman who lived in the building next door to Jeffrey Dahmer, had actually called police multiple times about the strange smells and sounds. She'd even called to follow up after the Konarak incident, trying to report that something was wrong with the situation the officers had dismissed. Her calls were ignored or minimized. She was told the matter had been handled. These women knew something was wrong. They felt it in their bones. But they were poor, many were minorities, and the system was not designed to listen to them. Jeffrey, meanwhile, continued his rituals. He began attempting to create an altar from his victims' remains, using skulls and bones arranged in a specific pattern. He painted some skulls, attempting to preserve them in a way that satisfied whatever aesthetic vision drove him. He was constructing something in that apartment, though what exactly remains open to interpretation? A shrine to his power over others? A physical manifestation of his desperate need for permanent companionship? The visualization of whatever dark spirituality existed in his fractured mind? The photographs would eventually become the most damning evidence against him. When investigators finally entered apartment 213, they found 84 Polaroids depicting the stages of dismemberment for various victims. These images made prosecution simple, but also traumatized everyone who viewed them. Some investigators who worked the case never recovered psychologically from what they witnessed in those photographs. July 22nd, 1991, the night everything changed. The night that Jeffrey Dahmer's 13-year reign of terror finally ended. The night that one man's desperate courage brought down a monster. His name was Tracy Edwards. He was 32 years old, originally from Mississippi, a man who had come to Milwaukee seeking better opportunities. On that summer evening, Tracy encountered Jeffrey Dahmer outside a mall. Jeffrey was polite, friendly, and offered Tracy money to come back to his apartment, pose for photographs, and watch videos with him. It was a familiar approach, the same one Jeffrey had used successfully with so many victims before. Tracy agreed. He needed the money. Jeffrey seemed harmless enough. Back at apartment 213, the evening started normally. Jeffrey offered Tracy a drink. They talked. Jeffrey showed Tracy around his apartment, and that's when Tracy noticed something strange. There was a terrible smell in the apartment. There were padlocks on some of the doors. There was a large blue barrel in the corner that seemed out of place. And on the walls, there were photographs of naked men, photographs that seemed to show bodies in various states of dismemberment. Tracy's survival instincts began screaming at him. Something was very wrong. Jeffrey's demeanor changed as the evening progressed. He became more insistent, more controlling. At some point, he produced a large knife and a pair of handcuffs. He managed to get one cuff around Tracy's wrist before Tracy fully realized what was happening. Jeffrey then forced Tracy into the bedroom at knife point, where he made Tracy lie on the bed and listen to his heartbeat. What Tracy Edwards did not know was that Jeffrey had refined his ritual over years. By this point in the evening, previous victims had typically consumed enough drugged alcohol to be incapacitated. But Tracy, whether by luck or instinct, had not finished his drink. He was still fully conscious, fully aware, and fully capable of fighting back. Jeffrey told Tracy about his plans. He spoke of eating Tracy's heart. He mentioned that they would never be apart. He showed Tracy the photographs on the wall. pointing out that these were previous companions who had stayed with him. The monologue was rambling, disconnected, the words of a man whose grip on reality had almost entirely slipped. Tracy listened. Tracy waited. Tracy looked for any opportunity to escape. For nearly 5 hours, Tracy Edwards played along, talking to Jeffrey, keeping him calm, waiting for the right moment. It was an excruciating psychological ordeal. Tracy knew that the slightest wrong move could trigger violence. He knew that the handcuff on his wrist connected him to a man who had killed at least 17 people. He knew that survival depended entirely on his ability to manage an impossible situation. Finally, Tracy saw his chance. He asked to use the bathroom, a reasonable request that Jeffrey granted. The bathroom had a window. If Tracy could get to the bathroom, get the window open, he might be able to call for help or escape entirely. But Jeffrey accompanied him, never letting his guard down completely. Back in the living room, Tracy tried another approach. He continued talking to Jeffrey, waiting for any moment of distraction. Eventually, such a moment came. Jeffrey's attention wavered, perhaps due to his own intoxication, and Tracy seized the opportunity. He punched Jeffrey Dahmer in the face. The blow stunned Jeffrey long enough for Tracy to run. He fled from apartment 213, still handcuffed, running down the street in a blind panic. He flagged down a Milwaukee police car, driven by officers Robert Routh and Rolf Muller. His words tumbled out frantically, telling them about the knife, the handcuffs, the photographs, the man who wanted to eat his heart. The officers were skeptical. Tracy Edwards was a black man in visible distress, telling a wild story about a killer. But they followed up, accompanying Tracy back to the Oxford apartments. Jeffrey Dahmer answered the door calmly, as he always did. He was cooperative, polite, and explained that there had simply been a misunderstanding between him and his friend. But Officer Muller asked about the handcuff on Tracy's wrist. Jeffrey said the key was in the bedroom. Muller went to get it. What he found in that bedroom changed everything. The drawer with the key also contained Polaroid photographs of human bodies in various stages of dismemberment. Photographs that could not possibly be explained away as consensual or accidental. Muller called out to his partner. Jeffrey Dahmer knew it was over. He made a final attempt to resist, struggling briefly with the officers, but was quickly subdued and handcuffed. Within minutes, backup had arrived. Within hours, investigators began the process of cataloging the full horror of apartment 213. Tracy Edwards, through his courage and quick thinking, had survived. More importantly, he had stopped Jeffrey Dahmer from ever killing again. The investigation of apartment 213 lasted several days and required the efforts of dozens of investigators, medical examiners, and forensic specialists. What they found inside that small apartment defies adequate description, but I will do my best to convey the magnitude of what was discovered. In the freezer, investigators found 3 human heads. They found packages of human flesh, some labeled and dated. They found a human heart that Jeffrey later admitted he had planned to eat. The freezer had become a storage facility for remains that Jeffrey wanted to preserve, a trophy case of his victims. In a filing cabinet, they found human skulls, some bleached and cleaned, others painted in shades of gray. Jeffrey had been working to create permanent displays from his victims, following the techniques his father had inadvertently taught him decades earlier. The skulls were arranged carefully, almost reverently, suggesting they held deep significance in whatever ritual Jeffrey was constructing. In the bedroom closet, there were more remains. Bones, photographs, and personal effects taken from victims. Jeffrey had kept identification from some of his victims, allowing investigators to begin the long process of determining exactly how many people had died in that apartment. In the corner of the living room stood a 57-gallon blue barrel. Inside, dissolving in acid, were the remains of several victims. The barrel's contents represented Jeffrey's method of disposal for body parts he could not preserve. The smell that neighbors had complained about for months emanated largely from this barrel. Perhaps most disturbing were the tools. Jeffrey had accumulated a collection of saws, knives, and power tools specifically designed for dismemberment. There was a drill that he had used in his attempts to create lobotomized zombies. There were chemicals purchased specifically for dissolving human tissue. The preparation involved suggested that Jeffrey's crimes were not impulsive, but carefully planned over a long period. The apartment itself seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Investigators who entered reported feeling physically ill, not just from the smell, but from an overwhelming sense of evil that seemed to permeate the walls. Seasoned detectives who'd seen countless crime scenes found themselves weeping, vomiting, requiring psychological support after spending time in apartment 213. As news of the discovery spread, Milwaukee descended into chaos. Reporters from around the world descended on the city. The name Jeffrey Dahmer became instantly synonymous with the most extreme forms of human depravity. Media coverage was relentless and often sensationalized, turning tragedy into entertainment. But for the families of victims, the coverage brought something else: answers. After months or years of wondering what had happened to their loved ones, they finally knew. The knowledge was devastating, but it was also, in a terrible way, closure. They could stop hoping their sons and brothers would walk through the door. They could begin the long process of grieving. Jeffrey Dahmer cooperated fully with investigators from the moment of his arrest. He confessed to 17 murders in detail that matched the physical evidence. He explained his methods, his motivations, and his psychological state throughout his killing spree. Some investigators found his cooperation almost more disturbing than the crimes themselves. He discussed dismemberment and cannibalism with the same detachment another person might use to describe their morning commute. Why did he cooperate so completely? Jeffrey himself said he was tired. The burden of his secret life had become unbearable. Some part of him was relieved to finally be caught, to finally stop. He also expressed something that might be interpreted as remorse, though the depth and sincerity of that remorse remains debated to this day. The confession process took weeks. Jeffrey was interviewed for over 60 hours, walking investigators through each victim chronologically. He answered every question, no matter how graphic. He helped identify remains that might otherwise have gone unidentified. His cooperation earned him nothing legally, but perhaps provided some comfort to families seeking to understand what had happened to their loved ones. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began on January 30th, 1992, and lasted approximately 2 weeks. The proceedings attracted international attention, with media from around the world covering every detail, but the trial itself was not about whether Jeffrey was guilty. He had confessed to everything. He was pleading guilty but insane. The central question before the jury was whether Jeffrey Dahmer met the legal definition of insanity at the time of his crimes. In Wisconsin, this meant determining whether Jeffrey suffered from a mental disease that prevented him from understanding right from wrong, or from conforming his behavior to the law. If the jury found him insane, he would be committed to a psychiatric facility. If they found him sane, he would go to prison. The prosecution argued that Jeffrey's elaborate planning proved his sanity. The careful preparation, the methodical disposal of evidence, the ability to hold down a job and maintain an apartment while killing. These were not the actions of someone who could not distinguish right from wrong. The prosecution presented testimony from surviving witnesses and family members of victims, putting human faces to the crime statistics. The defense countered with psychiatric testimony. Experts diagnosed Jeffrey with various conditions, including borderline personality disorder, psychotic disorder, and necrophilia. They argued that his compulsions were so overwhelming that he could not control them, that his mental state prevented him from conforming to legal standards, even if he understood them intellectually. Jeffrey himself took the stand and provided testimony that chilled everyone present. He spoke of his loneliness, his desperate need for companionship that could never leave him. He described his victims with a mixture of detachment and something that almost resembled affection. He explained his rituals and his motivations in clinical detail. One moment in particular captured national attention. The father of one victim, Thomas Jacobson, whose son had been killed, approached the stand and asked the judge for permission to address Jeffrey directly. The judge granted permission, and Jacobson delivered an emotional statement about what the loss of his son had meant to his family. Jeffrey listened, seemingly unmoved, though tears did fall at certain points. After 15 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for approximately 5 hours. They found Jeffrey Dahmer sane and guilty on all 15 murder charges presented at trial. The judge sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, later increased to 16 when Jeffrey pleaded guilty to his first murder, that of Stephen Hicks, in Ohio. In his statement to the court, Jeffrey said something that has been debated ever since. He claimed that he wished he could have simply died after his first murder, that he never wanted to hurt anyone else. He said he understood why people hated him and that they should hate him. He said he was sorry. Whether these words represented genuine remorse or simply another manipulation from a master manipulator remains unknown. What we do know is that Jeffrey Dahmer would spend the rest of his life in prison, and that life would not be long. Jeffrey Dahmer was incarcerated at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. As one of the most notorious prisoners in American history, his safety was a constant concern. For the first year, he was kept in protective isolation, separated from the general prison population. But Jeffrey requested transfer to general population. He said the isolation was driving him mad, that he needed human contact even if it came from other prisoners. Prison officials eventually granted his request, though they maintained certain precautions. Jeffrey was assigned to a work detail that limited his exposure to other inmates. During his time in prison, Jeffrey became a born-again Christian. He was baptized in the prison's whirlpool tub by a minister named Roy Ratcliffe, who visited him regularly for Bible study. Jeffrey claimed to have found peace through faith. to have accepted responsibility for his crimes, and to have found forgiveness from God, even if he could never find it from society. Some viewed this religious conversion with skepticism, seeing it as another manipulation or delusion. Others believed it was genuine, that Jeffrey Dahmer had finally found something that filled the void that his crimes had never satisfied. Reverend Ratcliffe, who spent considerable time with Jeffrey, believed the conversion was sincere. Jeffrey also corresponded with his father during his imprisonment. Lionel Dahmer struggled to reconcile his love for his son with the horror of his son's crimes. He eventually wrote a book examining how his son became a monster, searching for clues in their shared past. The book was controversial but provided insight into a family trying to understand the incomprehensible. The victims' families found no such peace. For them, Jeffrey's continued existence was an ongoing torment. They had to live knowing that the man who murdered their loved ones was still alive, still breathing, still receiving meals and shelter at taxpayer expense. Some families channeled their grief into advocacy, pushing for changes in the legal system that had failed their children. Others simply tried to survive each day. But the Milwaukee community also struggled to heal. The Oxford apartments were demolished in 1992, erased as if removing the building might remove the memories. A movement emerged to create a memorial for the victims, though funding proved difficult. The neighborhood where Jeffrey hunted remained scarred, its residents forever changed by what had happened among them. Meanwhile, the officers who had returned Conorak synthesome to Jeffrey's custody faced consequences. John Balserzak and Joseph Gabrish were fired from the police department, though they successfully appealed and were reinstated. The decision to reinstate them sparked protests and outrage. How could officers whose negligence contributed to multiple deaths be allowed to continue wearing badges? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, reflected broader systemic problems. The officers' actions that night were consistent with departmental culture, with biases that permeated law enforcement, with a system that did not value certain victims as much as others. Punishing two officers would not fix these deeper issues, and restoring them to duty seemed easier than confronting the uncomfortable truths their failure represented. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer began his day like any other in Columbia Correctional Institution. He attended a work detail with two other inmates, assigned to clean a gymnasium bathroom. The other inmates were Jesse Anderson, a white man who had murdered his wife and blamed the crime on black attackers, and Christopher Scarver, a black man serving time for a first-degree murder committed during a robbery. What happened in that bathroom has been reconstructed from physical evidence and Scarver's later statements. At some point during their work detail, Scarver attacked both Dahmer and Anderson with a metal bar taken from the weight room. Jeffrey was struck repeatedly in the head and face with tremendous force. The attack was swift and brutal. Prison guards found Jeffrey collapsed on the bathroom floor with severe head trauma. He was rushed to a hospital, but never regained consciousness. Jeffrey Dahmer was pronounced dead at 9:11 a.m., approximately 1 hour after the attack. He was 34 years old. Jesse Anderson died from his injuries 2 days later. Christopher Scarver would later say that he believed God had directed him to kill both men, that they had been spared by the legal system, but would not be spared by divine justice. Whether this was genuine religious conviction, mental illness, or post hoc rationalization remains unclear. The news of Jeffrey Dahmer's death spread quickly and provoked wildly different reactions. Some celebrated, viewing his killing as justice that the legal system had been unable or unwilling to deliver. "He got what he deserved," became a common refrain. The families of some victims expressed relief that they would never again have to think about the possibility of his release or parole. Others worried about what his death represented. If a prisoner could be murdered in custody, what did that say about the prison system's ability to maintain order and safety? If society celebrated extrajudicial killing, what did that say about our commitment to rule of law? These questions had no easy answers. For me, standing here telling you this story, the death of Jeffrey Dahmer represents something complex. There is no denying the relief that many felt, the sense that a chapter had finally closed. But there is also something troubling about finding satisfaction in murder, even the murder of a monster. What I do know is this: the real victory in the Jeffrey Dahmer case belongs to the survivors and the families who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. It belongs to Tracy Edwards, whose courage ended the killing spree. It belongs to Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, who tried desperately to save Conarak's synthesome phone, even when the authorities would not listen. It belongs to the mothers and fathers who searched for their children, who demanded answers, who forced a system to acknowledge its failures. And the legacy of this case has led to real changes. Law enforcement training now includes better recognition of serial predators. Missing person protocols have improved, though much work remains. The LGBTQ community has gained resources for protecting vulnerable members. Civil rights organizations have used this case to highlight the dangers of racial and sexual orientation bias in policing. And the victims themselves are remembered. Not as statistics, not as horror story fodder, but as human beings who mattered. Stephen Hicks, Stephen Tuomi, Jamie Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Conarak Synthesome Phone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, Joseph Braidhoft. 17 names, 17 lives cut short. 17 reasons why we must do better. I began this story by asking what if? What if we had recognized the warning signs earlier? What if the system had done its job? What if bias had not blinded authorities to the truth? These questions haunt everyone touched by this tragedy. But I want to end with different questions. What if we learn from these failures? What if we build systems that protect the vulnerable regardless of their race, their sexuality, their economic status? What if we listen when someone says something is wrong, even if that someone does not fit our expectations? The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is ultimately a story about failure and redemption. Not his redemption, but ours. We failed those 17 young men. We owe them better. We owe it to their memory to ensure that their deaths were not meaningless, that their stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths and work for change. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about how we can better protect each other, then share it. Subscribe to this channel. Come back for more stories that matter. Because understanding darkness is the first step toward creating light. And remember Tracy Edwards, who fought back. Remember Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, who tried to save a child. Remember the families who never stopped searching. In their courage, in their persistence, in their refusal to accept injustice, lies the victory in this terrible tale. May the victims rest in peace. May their families find healing, and may we have the wisdom to learn from this tragedy so that it never happens again.